Welcome back to our New Voices online talk series on women in the history of analytic philosophy and philosophy of science. Today's talk is held by Dr. Amanda Favia. She is a philosopher and bioethicist. She earned her PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center with a dissertation addressing issues of metaethics and evolutionary theory. She held fellowships at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and at the National Center for Ethics in Healthcare at the Veterans Health Administration. She is currently an associate professor of philosophy at Nassau Community College in New York. Her research ranges from metaethics and epistemic injustice in healthcare to the history of women in philosophy. She has published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, American Journal of Bioethics, and the Mount Sinai Journal of Medicine. She is also a long-standing member of the Oxford Mount Sinai Consortium on Bioethics, the American Philosophical Association, and the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. And today she will give a talk on what self-love got to do with it, Emily Elizabeth Constance Jones on the deduction of prudence from benevolence. Many thanks, Amanda. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me here today to participate. I'm just going to share my screen since I have a PowerPoint. Okay, so my talk today, again, is titled, What Self-Love Got to Do with It? E. Constance Jones on the Deduction of Prudence from Benevolence. So just to start with an overview of today's talk, I will begin by giving a brief biography of Jones and a little bit of philosophical background. And then I will get to the heart of the discussion with dualism of practical reason and Jones's responses, followed by some considerations and challenges to these responses by Jones. So born in Wales in 1848, Emily Elizabeth Constance Jones was educated at home until entering Girton College in 1875. Girton College was then the newly formed Women's College at Cambridge University. And while at Cambridge, she studied with Henry Sidgwick, which we'll see greatly influenced her views in ethics, as well as with James Ward and John Neville Keynes. So although her undergraduate career was punctuated with some familial responsibilities, for example, she sometimes had to take care of her aunt who was actually paying for her education, she did succeed in achieving first class in the moral sciences tripos in 1880. And then in 1884, she was invited back to be a research student, which then began a lifelong career at Girton. She was a resident lecturer in the moral sciences starting in 1884. Then she became a librarian in 1890, followed by her tenure as vice mistress in 1896 and mistress in 1903. It's also, I think, important to mention that Jones became a member of the Aristotelian Society in 1892, and she became the first, second, and third woman to lecture for Cambridge in the moral sciences from 1899 to 1906. And she also served as an executive member from 1914 to 1960. Jones is now known, if at all, mostly for her work in philosophical logic, but she also made contributions to ethics and moral psychology. I think it's important here maybe to note that Jones was one of Henry Sidgwick's prize students. She was charged with reviewing Sidgwick's students' papers from Girton and from Newman College and for proofreading many of his writings. She also became his literary executor, and she was in charge with compiling the index of the fourth and subsequent editions of the Method of Ethics, as well as correcting and proving supplementary material for posthumous editions. And finally, not only did she have an extensive number of publications, she often frequently participated in symposia with distinguished figures such as F.H. Bradley, W.E. Johnson, F.C.S. Schiller. And while Russell was privately dismissive of Jones, he did see it fit or sufficiently important to address her work at lectures in the Cambridge Moral Sciences Club. So I think we can see here, even from this extremely brief and incomplete biography of Jones, that although she's mostly forgotten today, she was a prominent figure in English philosophy from around 1890 until her death in 1922. Today, my talk is going to focus on her views in ethics. So, like her mentor Sidgwick, Jones argues that the study of ethics should focus on determining the truth of normative claims rather than establishing the metaphysical grounds. And although Jones recognizes that there is distinction, she argues that sorry about that, that no doubt ethics considered as a science has what has been called a metaphysical basis, and the determination of this is of the last interest and importance, but is not the science itself. And the great question of scientific ethics, what is right, has to be discussed separately from an investigation of that basis. So as such, much of her work in ethics really aims at defending a normative theory she calls rational hedonism, which is a form of ethical hedonism that mirrors Sidgwick's universalistic hedonism. The view that actions are objectively right, which produce the greatest amount of overall happiness. She says, my reason for choosing the name rational hedonism, which I have taken, is the doctrine of ethical hedonism, with which I am here concerned, appears to me both in its harmony as with common sense, well understood, and philosophic completeness, to answer the demands of reason as no other doctrine of which I am acquainted does. And that oddly enough, this characteristic of rationality has not been appreciated by some of his most profound critics, who in fact base certain of their objections in its supposed inherent irrationality. So rather than establishing a distinct ethical theory, Jones primarily defends a Sidgwickian view with an additional emphasis on rationality, which we'll later see is going to play a central role in her resolutions to the dualism of practical reason, which is the topic of today's talk. And since rational hedonism is not a doctrine that's unique to Jones, many have viewed Jones' writings on ethics as just mere exposition. But I think that this is a premature dismissal of Jones, and it unfairly overlooks these multiple attempts that she's made to try and resolve a problem that Sidgwick raised, but failed on his own terms to adequately address. And that is this problem of the dualism of practical reason. So Jones acknowledges that the dualism of practical reason is something to contend with in one of her earliest defenses of rational hedonism. She says, in short, it appears that the ever reoccurring moral controversy between pleasure and virtue is neither more nor less a controversy between the agent's happiness and the happiness of others. And is a controversy not between reason and unreason, but between two competing reasonable ends. And this inevitable dualism or twofold aspect of the end commended by reason still subsists within utilitarianism, and in the opinion of its adherents, constitutes the most important difficulty of the system of universalistic hedonism. So I think what Jones is doing here is that she is identifying the dualism of practical reason as one of the main issues that the utilitarian must face, in that the happiness of the individual, right? This either sometimes referred to as self-love or we'll say prudence, and the happiness of others, again, referred here sometimes as benevolence or conscience, can come into conflict while at the same time being equally rational, or that is reasonable. And it is precisely this conflict between two rational ends, and thus a dualism, that worried Sidgwick. In one of her last works on ethics called Practical Dualism, Jones addresses this seemingly problematic dualism head on, but she begins her paper by quoting Joseph Butler, who had said, reasonable self-love and conscience are the chief and superior principles in the nature of man, because an action may be suitable to his nature, though all other principles be violated, but becomes unsuitable if either of those is. What we're seeing here is that Jones is arguing that the initial identification of the dualism does not actually begin with Sidgwick, but with his predecessor, Butler. But she continues to say, I have adopted as motto Bishop Butler's statement of what Professor Sidgwick calls the dualism of the practical reason, because although the form in which Butler states it is not precisely that which I wish to support, he was, I believe, the first thinker who definitely formulated such a dualism. So what really differs then between Butler and Sidgwick is that Butler did not see this dualism as a problem, whereas Sidgwick, and we'll see Jones, do. But I think it's fair then to ask the question of why do Jones and Sidgwick see this dualism as a problem that needs to be resolved? So to better understand why this dualism can be viewed as a problem, and thus what Jones is attempting to resolve, I think we should take a look more closely at Sidgwick's original formulation of the problem. So before getting into a discussion of Sidgwick's view of the dualism of practical reason, I do think that it's important to note that there has been a significant amount of debate about how to understand or how to interpret what Sidgwick meant by the dualism of practical reason. And so I really would like to say at this point that my aim here is not to defend any particular interpretation of Sidgwick's view within this broader debate that exists, but rather to present it in a form that I think Jones appears to be grappling with. Okay? So in the method of ethics, Sidgwick aims to provide a rational procedure by which we determine what individual humans ought or what it is right for them to do. Okay? And it's from this investigation that Sidgwick comes to hold the view that he finds undoubtedly to perceive as clearly and certainly as any axiom in arithmetic or geometry, that it is right and reasonable for me to treat others as I should think that I myself ought to be treated under similar conditions, and to what I believe to be ultimately conducive to the universal good or happiness. So again, it leads him to his view that what is morally right will produce the greatest amount of overall happiness. However, in holding this view, Sidgwick does acknowledge that we might have an issue. So he acknowledges that both our conscience, right, or universal benevolence, and prudence, or reasonable self-love, are both principles of practical rationality. And herein lies the problem. In certain cases, there appear to be two rational methods of ethics, and it's possible then that we have two rational methods that give us two different answers about what we ought to do. And then there is no obvious rational method by which we should choose one over the other. So just to give sort of like a brief example is thinking of maybe my rational principles tell me like reasonable self-love might tell me that I should save myself, but I could also sacrifice. Benevolence might tell me that I should sacrifice my life for someone else. And so it might be that these two practical methods of ethics give me conflicting answers. So if I follow in the scenario reasonable self-love, I ought to save myself. If I follow universal benevolence, then maybe I have to sacrifice myself for somebody else. And in these kinds of cases, right, he's thinking of a situation when there be sort of no way to sort of choose between the two. Now, this is especially problematic for Sidgwick because he argues that our moral principles must meet a standard of self-evidence. So what he's arguing is that our moral principles must possess the characteristics of which self-evidence are distinguished from mere opinions, right? That is, they must not only be obtained via careful reflection, be clear and be precise, but they also must be consistent. If two or more principles are inconsistent relative to a scenario that's whether real or imagined, then the standard is not met. One or another of the principles must be rejected or somehow restricted. And it's in this situation of a recognized conflict between self-interest and duty that practical reason, being divided against itself, would cease to be a motive on either side. And this is the dualism of practical reason. So in the method of ethics, Sidgwick does attempt to consider a possible resolution, thinking of the existence of a God that's maybe capable of reconciling this dualism. However, he argues that this solution fails since it does not meet his own standard of self-evidence. Sidgwick argues that, well, perhaps this is desirable. The existence of such a God cannot be established rationally, or it can't be known to us with any kind of certainty. He says, but I cannot find inseparably connected with this conviction and similarly attainable by mere reflective intuition any cognition that there actually is a supreme being who will adequately reward me for obeying these rules of duty or punish me for violating them, or omitting the strictly theological element of the proposition. I may say that I do not find in my moral consciousness any intuition claiming to be clear and certain that the performance of the duty will be rewarded and its violation punished. So here, this answer fails for Sidgwick because it fails to meet his own standard of self-evidence. And this dualism really remained for Sidgwick. He didn't think he found a resolution to it, and he wasn't very hopeful that there would be a resolution. In later editions of the Method of Ethics, he concludes by saying, if then the reconciliation of duty and self-interest is regarded as a hypothesis logically necessary to avoid a fundamental contradiction in one chief department of our thought, it remains to ask how far this necessity constitutes a sufficient reason for accepting this hypothesis. This, however, is a profoundly difficult and controverted question, the study of which belongs to the treatise of general philosophy, then to the work on the method of ethics, which it could not be satisfactorily answered without a general examination of the criteria of true and false beliefs. And so I just mentioned before that this was from later editions. In earlier editions of the methods, he's actually more pessimistic about what this problem does for the method of ethics. And I have another quote here I'll just read to you that I don't have on the slide. In his first edition, he instead concluded with, the cosmos of duty is thus really reduced to chaos, and the prolonged effort of the human intellect to frame a perfect ideal of rational conduct is seen to have been foredoomed to inevitable failure, right? So he's even more pessimistic here, not so optimistic, but not as pessimistic. Even when Jones is writing about this dualism, she points out to sort of remember where Sidgwick was with this problem, right? She says, it will be remembered that in Mr. Sidgwick's view, no complete reconciliation between universalistic and egoistic hedonism can be demonstrated either on the basis of experience or sympathy or on theological or metaphysical grounds. So I think here she's pointing out that conflict again between universalistic hedonism, or as we'll see, this idea of rational self-love and prudence, compared to egoistic hedonism just make those up. So universalistic hedonism is with benevolence and conscience, and egoistic hedonism is with rational self-love and prudence. And so that conflict is that dualism that requires a solution that meets Sidgwick's standards of self-evidence. And for Sidgwick, again, this really hasn't happened. So since Sidgwick's formulation of the dualism of practical reason, there have been numerous attempts to either understand, resolve, dismiss this dualism as a philosophical problem. But this literature fails to include Jones, even though she provides one of the earliest responses to this problem. And most of her writings in ethics make attempts at trying to resolve this dualism. So just thinking of works, there's so much literature on this problem, but like Frank Kenna, Chris, Shaver, Brank, they don't discuss what Jones says in these arguments. And so I think that she's been entirely overlooked, even though she's made multiple unique attempts at resolving this problem that go beyond mere exposition. So even though Jones is often really working just to sort of keep in line with Sidgwick's views, she is still making her own distinct arguments about this problem, and I think that they are worthy of philosophical debate. So just to sort of group her arguments, it's just three categories. I would say they go into sort of this argument that the dualism is irreducible. Then there's an argument from temporal irrelevance, and then an argument from mutual dependency. Today, I'm just going to talk about the two last arguments, the argument from temporal irrelevance and the argument from mutual dependency, partially because I think that these were her most promising. So in her argument from temporal irrelevance, Jones aims to show that the dualism between conscience or universal benevolence and reasonable self-love, prudence, does not lead to an irreconcilable conflict between two rational methods or principles, right? That is, instead, the rationality of benevolence is deduced from the rationality of self-love rather than being opposed to it. And so another way of looking at it is like once we understand rational self-love, it follows that we understand how it implies rational benevolence. So how does this happen for Jones? In the defense of rational hedonism, she says the following. She says, the rational end of human action, the good of man, that which is ultimately worth having in itself is happiness. It is this delightfulness of conscious life which ought to be sought by each for himself and the whole community of rational and sensitive beings of which he is a member. So here, Jones is making an argument that it's not merely one's individual happiness, but also the happiness of the community that matters. And furthermore, an individual should be understood as both an individual qua individual and an individual member of the community, so part of a whole. And is this conception of the individual and the individual's relation to the community that would turn out to be central to her argument. So she continues by arguing that the goodness of the whole is determined by the goodness of its parts. So she says, as a conscious individual, it is necessarily, not to say rationally, concerned with the quality of one's own consciousness throughout. As consciously part of a larger whole, each is naturally concerned with the quality of consciousness of all of those who compose that whole. Further, since this conscious life, as known by us, is subject to the condition of time, of the realization in successive parts, the goodness of this whole is not independent of the goodness of its parts. So from this quote here, we get a better understanding of what Jones wants to say rational self-love or prudence is and what rational benevolence or conscience is. With rational self-love or prudence, if an individual life, we can think of that as a whole, is made of a series of conscious moments, its parts, then the individual ought to be equally concerned with all conscious moments or parts of their life, the whole. And as such, there is no reason, right, no rational principle by which one should choose one moment of one's life over any other, everything else being equal. Thus, an individual ought to be impartial and equally concerned with all moments of one's life, what we can call an intrapersonal neutrality. So, for example, my happiness today is just as important as my happiness tomorrow or my happiness in 10 years. There is no reason that demands I ought to care more about my present happiness than my future happiness. Instead, I ought to be concerned with my entire life and thus all moments equally. I think it's also here important to note that Jones is making a normative claim about what we ought to do, that is, what is rational, and not a descriptive or an empirical claim about what we actually do. So I might be really bad at choosing my future self over my present self. I might even be really bad at choosing things that are really in my own self-interest. And it's also may be important to note that she is, defending a rational hedonist view. And so this view aims at maximizing pleasure for the whole, right? As opposed to an Epicurean hedonist who would be merely aiming at pursuing what is pleasurable, right? So we're still looking at this greater good. So it is from this understanding of rational self-love, of prudence, that we come to understand rational benevolence, right, or conscience. So analogously, if the community or the whole is made of individual conscious members, its parts, then the individual member ought to be equally concerned with all individual members or parts of the community, right, the whole. And as such, there is no reason by which one should choose oneself over any other. Thus, an individual ought to be impartial and equally concerned with all members of the community, right, an interpersonal neutrality. And again, here she's making another normative claim rather than a descriptive or an empirical one. So it's within this framework that we get to this idea of deducing rational benevolence from rational self-love. If it is rational for me to be impartially concerned with all of the moments that make up my life, the interpersonal neutrality, then I can draw the logical conclusion that it's also rational for me to be concerned with all of the members of the community that make up the community of which I am a member, an interpersonal neutrality. In other words, we can deduce the rationality of benevolence, from the rationality of self-love. That is, benevolence is rational given self-love. And then for Jones, rather than practical reason being, as Sidgwick said, divided against itself between rational self-love and rational benevolence, the status of benevolence as a rational principle originates in self-love. So that is her argument from temporal irrelevance. And so I think at this point, I'll sort of take some time then to consider whether this argument is successful at resolving Sidgwick's dualism of practical reason. And just sort of like a recap again of what Sidgwick was arguing, right? He saw and I think Jones is seeing it the same way, the dualism of practical reason as a problem, not simply because there are two foundations of ethics or two oughts, but rather that we have circumstances under which we have two oughts that, though incompatible, are both reasonable. In such cases, it's not merely that we have an ethical dilemma, which we have to choose between two competing imperatives using one rational principle, right? That's just an ethical dilemma. But instead, we have two competing rational principles giving two competing moral imperative. And reason tells us that both rational principles are equally rational. In other words, reason demands that we follow both contradictory imperatives, which is impossible. And in some cases, we cannot appeal to, in this kind of case, I should say, we cannot appeal to reason to resolve this conflict, since reason is the cause of the conflict. Again, I think I should note here that Sidgwick and I think Jones is searching for a resolution that meets Sidgwick's standard of self-evidence, right? We're still looking for something that's clear, precise, and consistent. I think that since Jones is aiming to resolve this problem in line with Sidgwick's view, it's fair to ask whether she meets that standard of self-evidence that he has set up. And I think at first glance, Jones appears to present an argument with temporal relevance that meets the standard of self-evidence. The argument from temporal relevance is clear, it's precise, it's consistent, right? The idea of the rationality of benevolence being derived from the rationality of self-love is not contradictory. However, Jones's argument that the rationality of benevolence or conscience derives from the rationality of self-love, prudence, I think it still fails to fully evade or resolve the dualism of practical reason. So even if the rationality of self-love is prior to the rationality of benevolence, a contradiction between imperatives that are equally rational could still arise. So basically, it does not guarantee that both rational principles, which are still distinct rational principles, would always point us in the same kind of direction. Contradiction between imperatives that are equally rational could still arise. And while rational self-love and rational benevolence, they might be connected in this way that she argues, reason could still demand that both benevolence and self-love are equally rational in a given circumstance. So again, the conflict presented by the dualism is not simply at the level of imperatives, like follow benevolence or follow self-love, but it's at the level of rationality. And as such, we would still need an additional rational principle to resolve this dilemma, or we would need an additional rational principle that says that one, benevolence or self-love, always comes prior to others in these types of circumstances, which I doubt that either Jones or Sidgwick really would want to say. So I think that all Jones has really shown us here with her argument is that the dualism may help us understand how benevolence is rational via rational self-love, but it doesn't eliminate the potential for a conflict between the two rational methods of ethics. So I'd like to consider another argument that she presents would perhaps move us closer to that resolution she's looking for. And this is what I'll call the argument from mutual dependency. So continuing with this line of reasoning, Jones again argues that rational benevolence comes from rational self-love. However, in this case, she argues that there's a mutual dependency between rational benevolence and rational self-love. In her final essay on this dualism of practical reason, called Practical Dualism, she concludes that rational benevolence implies or includes the rationality of self-love. And to support this claim, Jones argues that the only way we can understand the dictates of rational benevolence, that we ought to promote the happiness of others, is to recognize that the happiness of others is ultimately and intrinsically valuable to ourselves. So in Jones's view, right, we can't recognize the happiness in others unless we first recognize it in ourselves. So she says, a man cannot directly know any happiness but his own. It must therefore be on the ground that his own happiness is himself ultimately and intrinsically valuable in itself, that he can logically regard the happiness of others as ultimately and intrinsically valuable to them. His reasoned belief in the value for others of their own happiness must be based, it can only be based, on his recognition of the value for himself of his own happiness. Here, Jones is trying to say that I recognize that the happiness of others is ultimately and intrinsically valuable to them as individuals via the recognition of my own happiness being intrinsically and ultimately valuable to myself as an individual. And for Jones, the only way I could come to understand or accept this happiness of others being also my end is that is rational to promote the happiness of others just as much as rational to promote my own happiness is to understand it myself first. She says, it would thus appear that benevolence implies self-love, and rational benevolence irresistibly leads us back to the rationality of self-love as our starting point. Similarly, in the precepts, do unto other as ye would, reasonably would, they should do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself. It is implied that the love of self is logically prior to and sets the standard for love of our neighbor. So in this case, Jones is demonstrating that in order to understand, appreciate, and follow the dictates of rational benevolence, we must first understand and appreciate rational self-love. So self-love comes before benevolence, not in terms of which moral imperative must take priority, but rather in our ability to grasp and thus act on rational benevolence. So remember, for rational hedonism and for Sidgwick's universalistic hedonism, the ultimate good is happiness on the whole. And the rationality is only a method by which we determine how to achieve that ultimate end. So our ability to rationally follow benevolence depends on our grasping rational self-love. And that is her argument of mutual dependency. So again, I think at a point to sort of consider whether or not this argument that she presents, I'll start with sort of this question of whether it meets Sidgwick's standard of self-evidence. And again, I think similar to her previous argument, I think she does present an argument that meets Sidgwick's standard of self-evidence. The argument from mutual dependency, it's clear, it's precise, it's consistent. It's non-contradictory, but I think we're still in the same place, right? Jones's argument that rational self-love or prudence is prior to rational benevolence, it does not fully evade or resolve the dualism of practical reason. And I say this because even if Jones is correct, I think all she has shown that we may need self-love to understand benevolence and vice versa, but there still would not resolve the problem that arises if there is a conflict between the two rational principles, and nor does it prove that there would never be such a conflict in the first place. And we would still need some additional rational principle then to determine which imperative ought to take priority in such a case. Now, perhaps this dualism is required or necessary for us to grasp benevolence via rational self-love, but the question remains if it's necessarily true. And even if such a dualism is necessary, it does not follow, again, that this dualism is unproblematic. And I think that this is also kind of how Sidgwick saw it, and why maybe he didn't see an answer to it. And so I guess I should note here is I don't think that this implies that there's never an answer to this dilemma, but I think it's starting to, foreshadow this possibility that maybe we're not going to have like a rationalist or a cognitive answer to this kind of problem. So some last considerations are methodological. These are sort of more questions that I have than answers, given my study of Jones. So Jones, in the beginning, I had a slide with the quote where she points out that she really wants to do normative ethics. She's not interested in anything metaphysical. And I think this was in line with Sidgwick as well. But in her responses with both of her arguments of temporal irrelevance, especially with her argument from temporal irrelevance, is she perhaps doing metaphysics? Maybe there is a little bit more metaphysics than she wants there to be to try to resolve this dilemma. And so that's just something to consider. And then this leads to some further considerations of, well, maybe it's pointing us in a direction of what we need to be looking at. Maybe we do need some metaphysics to answer or resolve this dilemma. Maybe we can't get away with just studying the normative ethics, and maybe we actually need to do some of this metaphysics in order to resolve this dualism of practical reason. Maybe that's a way out of it. So in conclusion, I did argue that Jones's arguments fail to adequately resolve Sidgwick's dualism of practical reason, but I do think there are some things that Jones is successful at. So she really does help give us, through her analyses, a deeper understanding of the nature of the problem itself. So what the problem of the dualism of practical reason really is. And I think that her responses and her understanding of what the problem is give us a sort of change, perhaps, the nature of the debate. And as I just previously argued, it might also lead us towards a resolution for this problem. Okay, thank you so much. And I guess we'll just open the floor up to questions.